Okay, well that was really special. Thank you so much for those words. So this is going to be my last talk today for all, and this is a little bit of a bittersweet moment for me. This is my last lecture of this entire trip. It has now been, I've been on the road for 38 days. This is day 38 out of 39 that I've been traveling, and this is the 25th lecture that I've given in Africa over the last few weeks. So it is a little bit bittersweet for me right now, but I'm really glad to be with you all. And again, it's been a real honor to be able to work with Biocosmos and be here with you all over the last few days. So I was asking to talk about the fossil record and how it poses a challenge to Darwinism and support for intelligent design. And in my training as a geologist and also studying evolution, I've had many opportunities to learn about the fossil record and whether it shows sort of a documented record of evolution from one type of form to another, or whether it shows some other pattern that is better explained by intelligent design. So first of all, what are fossils? I'm sure that many of you have heard of fossils, or maybe even seen fossils before, but fossils are basically the preserved remains of dead organisms. And the reason why this is relevant to evolution is because, according to the theory of evolution, all species, both living and extinct or fossil species, share a common ancestor. So what is common ancestry? Well, common ancestry is the idea that all living organisms, you go back far enough, they share some kind of a common ancestor. So not only do all humans share a common ancestor, but we would also share a common ancestor with dogs and cats. You go back a little bit further, we would share a common ancestor with fish. Go back further, we share a common ancestor with trees. Further, we share a common ancestor with, the fungus growing on the bottom of your foot. And go back even further, and everything shares a common ancestor. So if all life forms belong via Darwinian processes and share a common ancestor, then the fossil record should show us a record of transitional forms that are documenting how one form of life evolved into another very slowly between life's various groups. So we can make sort of this prediction from evolutionary theory that if it's true, you should find these transitional forms. So before we get into this too much, I want to mention that there are three general models of the fossil record that we're going to talk about today, and we're going to ask which one is the best explanation. The first model is what we call gradualism. This is the idea that one type of organism evolved very, very slowly into another type of organism, and it should leave a record of that evolution in the fossil record. And under this model, of course, all living organisms share a common ancestor and everything evolved. But there's another model that also, in a similar way, says that all living organisms share a common ancestry and everything evolved. But it looks at the fossil record a little bit differently. It's called punctuated equilibrium, and we're going to talk about that more in a little while. But for now, I'm just going to say this model, like gradualism, also holds that everything evolved via Darwinian mechanisms and everything shared a common ancestor, but it says that evolution happened very rapidly. So you may or may not find those transitional forms. Finally, we're going to look at a third model, which I call the explosion model. And under this model, diverse types of organisms appear abruptly, very rapidly, without clear evolutionary precursors, and the fossil record does not document sort of these transitional forms that Darwin's theory predicts. So Darwin's view was that there should be these transitional forms, but he was aware, when he wrote Origin of Species, that the fossil record had not produced evidence of these transitional fossils. And so Darwin actually wrote in Origin of Species that the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed on the Earth must be truly enormous. And he then said, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And he then said, and this, perhaps, is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. So Darwin was very aware of the lack of transitional forms and that this posed a problem for his model of evolution. And this would be Darwin's model, this very gradual evolutionary change model. So the way that Darwin explained away the lack of transitional forms was by saying that the geological record is very imperfect, that basically most organisms don't end up being preserved as fossils, And also that our knowledge of the fossil record is imperfect. We have only dug up a very, very small percentage of all the fossils that exist. So he says that the geological record is imperfect, and that is why we did not have the transitional forms. But after Darwin, paleontologists basically sought out a quest to try to find these missing transitional fossils. And they did this for the next 100 plus years. And yes, occasional potential examples of transitional forms were found. We're going to talk about this in a little while. But by and large, these transitional forms were not actually found. And eventually, paleontologists had to face up to the fact that they were not finding these transitional forms, and the excuse of calling the fossil record incomplete fell out of favor. One of the main scientists to recognize that we did not have these transitional forms was Stephen Jay Gould. And Stephen Jay Gould was a paleontologist at Harvard University until he passed away a couple decades ago. But he wrote that Darwin's argument, talking about that the fossil record lacks transitional forms because it is incomplete, he said that it still persists as the favorite escape of most paleontologists from the embarrassment of a record that seems to show so little of evolution directly. So Stephen Jay Gould is saying, look, most paleontologists are aware that the transitional forms are not there, and they still deal to incompleteness. 100 years after Darwin, searching for these transitional fossils, they still have not been found, and the fossil record is sort of an embarrassment for evolution. And what people ended up doing, was they started to ask the question, is the fossil record really incomplete or not? And they started to do studies about the completeness of the fossil record, and eventually it was found that the fossil record, this is not working, the fossil record really is not that incomplete. So a study in paleobiology in 1997 said, our view of the history of biological diversity is mature. Another paper in 1999 in Nature said completeness is rather high for many animal groups. And another article in Nature said that if we scale to the level of the taxonomic level of the families, looking at families that are represented in the fossil record, it says the past 540 million years of the fossil record provide uniformly good documentation of the life of the past. Oh wow, you guys are awesome. Thank you so much. That's really appreciated. Thank you very much. So what these papers are saying is that actually the fossil record really is not that incomplete, and we have relatively good knowledge of what species have lived across the history of life. And so now scientists finally begin to acknowledge that there's a problem. The fossil record is not all that complete, but we don't have the transitional forms that Darwin predicted. And so two paleontologists, Miles Eldridge and Ian Tattersall, said that the record jumps. And all the evidence shows that the record is real. It's not just an incomplete record. The gaps we see reflect real events in life's history, not the artifact of a poor fossil record. And this quote is actually from a paleontologist named David Woodard, who I studied under when I was in my undergraduate studies at UC San Diego. And he said, evolutionary biologists can no longer ignore the fossil record on the ground that it is imperfect. So how do paleontologists sort of tell whether or not the fossil record is complete or incomplete? Well, they use something called a collector's curve. And the way you do a collector's curve is you have a graph here, and on the x-axis you will measure the total number of specimens that you find. And then on the y-axis you will measure the total number of different species or the different types of specimens that you find. So to give you an example of what this might mean, how many of you guys have ever taken a walk on the beach and you collected shells? You guys ever done that? So I grew up at the beach in LA, and we would often go for walks on the beach. So let's say you're walking down the beach and you find a little clam shell. So now you would put a little mark on this diagram. You found one specimen and you found one type of species. And then you're walking a little bit further and you find some seaweed on the beach. So now you found two specimens and you found two different types of species. But now you keep walking and you find a third thing on the beach. It's another clamshell. Now you found three specimens, but you already found a clamshell, so you've only still found two species. And as you go along, the more and more things you find, eventually you start to find things that you've already found, right? So at the beginning of your little investigation, this curve goes up sort of at a 1-to-1 rate. But eventually over time, you start to find all the things that are out there that are waiting to be found, or at least all types of things. So for each new specimen you find, you're probably not going to find very many new species. And what happens is the curve starts to level off. The more things you find, the number of species does not really go up anymore. And when the curve starts to level off, you know that you have a relatively complete knowledge of all the things that are out there waiting to be discovered. And so this collector's curve can help us measure our knowledge of the completeness of some data set. So, as paleontologists came to terms with the fact that the fossil record did not show transitional forms, we saw quotes like this coming out from people like Stephen Jay Gould. A lot of these sort of recognitions and this sort of coming to terms with the fact that they didn't have these transitional fossils happen in the 1970s and 1980s. And Gould wrote that the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. And he went on to say that the absence of fossil evidence for intermediate stages between major transitions in organic design, indeed, our inability, even in our imagination, to construct functional intermediates, in many cases has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. And by the way, my family, when I was a kid, we would watch Stephen Jay Gould. He would always be on like science documentaries. And we'd always joke that if you were to take my dad and add about 40 pounds or 50 pounds to him, he would look just like Stephen Jay Gould. So anyway, so what scientists begin to realize is that the fossil record actually does not show these transitional forms. It actually shows a pattern of explosion. So what we really see in the fossil record is a pattern of explosion, where new types of fossils and groups of organisms appear abruptly without clear evolutionary precursors. And in fact, paleontologists Gunther Beckley and Stephen Meyer have documented about 19 different explosions of different types of organisms in the history of life. You can read about this in the book Theistic Evolution. And this pattern stands in direct contrast to Darwin's prediction and the prediction of modern evolutionary theory. So let's take a quick look at some examples of some of these explosions in the history of life. One of the first major explosions is called the Avalon explosion. It happens in the fossil record according to the mainstream time scale around 575 to 565 million years ago. And you get these very strange organisms. They might have been sexual organisms, they're frog-like. They have an unusual type of symmetry, it's called line symmetry, where they're not exactly symmetrical, but it's often offset. And quite a few people have said that they don't know what they are. They might be algae or protists, or some kinds of strange colonial organisms. Nobody really knows what they are, but they appear very rapidly, without any clear and direct evolutionary precursors, and then they disappear. But one of the most important things about them is it's really probably very few people, or almost no one believes that they serve as potential precursors to later forms of animals. So they're really not necessarily accessible to the animals that come later. So what are some of the animals that come later? Well, at the end of about 500 million years ago, a little bit after this, we have what is called the Cambrian explosion. And in the Cambrian explosion, we see the abrupt appearance of almost all of the major animal groups called the phyla that we find in the fossil record. And these do represent basically many of them are the modern forms of animals that we see even alive today. And this has posed a real problem for evolutionary theory. In fact, Time magazine covered this a few years ago and called it Evolution's Big Bang. We're talking about organisms as diverse as arthropods, or annelid worms, or mollusks, or echinoderms. And you can see in this diagram there are these thick black lines that represent the time periods for which we have fossils for these various animal phyla. And then we have these thin black lines that represent sort of what is supposed to be the evolutionary ancestry or the evolutionary history of these various groups of organisms, but for which we don't have any fossils showing how they evolved. And what's interesting is you can see that for almost all of these animal groups, They appear at about the exact same time, around 530, 540 million years ago, and the thick black lines that continue all the way up to the modern day. They don't, but you can see here that the thick black lines don't connect. When you look for the connections between these various types of organisms, which is supposed to show how these organisms evolved, it's thin black lines. But the thin black lines represent what is, basically the fossils that are not there. So we don't have fossils documenting the evolution of these various types of animals. And again, we're talking about very diverse organisms, brachiopods, annelids, chordates, vertebrates. We even have fossil fish in the Cambrian explosion, arthropods. And this is very much against what Darwin's theory predicts. Darwin's theory predicts sort of this very slow and gradual branching process, which would then lead to the various types of organisms. Instead, we don't find this branching process. We find these major groups of organisms appearing abruptly and without clear and direct evolutionary precursors. So if we compare the theory of what evolution is supposed to predict versus the data and got to see these fossils firsthand, you can't obviously take them, but you can take photos of them. And then some of these yellowish colored fossils actually represent some Cambrian explosion fossils from China that we have in a collection discovered recently. It was given to us by a Chinese scientist. And so it's very, very special that we're able to have some of these fossils. So just to appreciate, what is mainstream science said about this. This is a quote from an invertebrate zoology textbook, and it says, most of the animal phyla that are represented in the fossil record first appeared fully formed in the Cambrian some 550 million years ago. The fossil record is therefore of no help with respect to the origin and early diversification of the various animal phyla. Well, I would say the fossil record is of no help if you're an evolutionist. If you're willing to just follow the evidence where it leads, as the Biocosmos motto says, then I think that it can help us a lot. And it helps us to understand that the evolutionary model is not fitting very well with the data. Even Richard Dawkins, the very famous atheist scientist, says it is as though, it's talking about the Cambrian fossils, it is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. So the Cambrian explosion is a very major challenge to, I would say, the evolutionary model. Now, the other thing we'll sometimes see from proponents of evolution is that, again, the fossil record is incomplete. We don't have an accurate record of the organisms that really live. And so the Cambrian explosion is not a real event in the history of life. It's just sort of something that appears to have happened, but it maybe doesn't represent the actual truth of the history of life on this planet. But again, if you talk to leading paleontologists who are experts in the paleontology of the Cambrian explosion, they will say that the Cambrian explosion was a real event. These are people who accept evolution, of course, but they acknowledge that the Cambrian explosion was real. So Irwin and Valentine say several lines of evidence are consistent with the reality of the Cambrian explosion. Or this Dutch biologist Mark Shepard says, it is now generally accepted that the Cambrian explosion was real. So a couple years ago in the journal Science, there was a very interesting article that said, the grand puzzle of the Cambrian explosion surely must reign as one of the most important, outstanding mysteries in evolutionary biology. In other words, what they're saying is, evolutionary biology has not explained the Cambrian explosion. So the question that comes up, we often will hear from people, well, what about other types of organisms? Not every living species arises during the Cambrian. We don't have mammals. They don't come around until much later. Birds and dinosaurs don't come around until much later. There are many other groups of organisms that don't come around until much later. Does that show sort of a gradual evolutionary progression of life which reflects evolution? Well, the answer that papers and authorities discuss the explosive diversification of mammal groups. And a book by Miles Aldrich says there are all sorts of gaps, absence of gradationally intermediate transitional forms between species, but also between large groups, between, say, families of carnivores or the orders of mammals. There's many examples of this, but to give you guys one last example, if you think of our own species, the name of our species is Homo sapiens. That means that we belong to the genus Homo, and then we're species sapiens. Now, when the genus Homo appears in the fossil record, we're talking about the first appearance of the human-like body plan in the fossil record. And what we see is that even our own genus Homo appears in this very abrupt fashion. The great Harvard evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr said that the earliest fossils of Homo are separated from Australopithecus by a large unbridged gap. How can we explain the seeming saltation? Saltation would be a jump or abrupt change in the fossil record. Well, he said, not having any fossils that can serve as missing links, we have to fall back on the time-honored method of historical science, the construction of a historical narrative. So what he's basically saying is, we don't have fossils. He calls them missing links. We don't have fossils documenting how our genus Homo evolved. So we have to tell a story. And that story is fine to tell, but we don't have evidence from the fossil record showing how our genus evolved from our supposed Australopithecine ancestors. Talking about the Australopithecine, if you are an evolutionary scientist, talking about the lack of transitional species, a radical transformation, or a genetic revolution. And in fact, one mainstream commentator about this evidence calls it a Big Bang theory of human evolution. So even our own genus Homo appears abruptly in an explosive Big Bang type fashion in the fossil record. And then there are other examples of this as well. There's an explosion of marine reptiles in the Mesozoic. There's the abrupt appearance of various dinosaur groups. There's the odontoid explosion, which documents various tooth groups. There's an insect explosion in the Carnivorous, and there are other examples as well. So when we look at the overall pattern of the fossil record, what we see is what Mayr again says this. He says, new species usually appear in the fossil record suddenly, not connected with their ancestors by a series of intermediates. And another scientist, Jeffrey Schwartz, an anthropologist at the University of Pittsburgh, he says, we are still in the dark about the origin of most major groups of organisms. They appear in the fossil record as Athena did from the head of Zeus, full-blown and raring to go, in contradiction to Darwin's depiction of evolution as resulting from the gradual accumulation of countless infinitesimally minute variations. Okay, so we're not seeing these predicted transitional forms, and many groups of organisms appear in a manner that contradicts the predictions of Darwin's theory. But how have evolutionists responded to this evidence in the modern day? Well, I mentioned earlier that a lot of the scientists who began to acknowledge that we didn't have these transitional forms, they did their work in the 1970s and 1980s. And during that time, a number of these scientists developed a new model, a new way of looking at evolution called punctuated equilibrium. And it was proposed by Miles Aldrich and Stephen Jay Gould. And it basically said that rather than species evolving very gradually and slowly over long periods of time in very large populations, it said actually most evolution takes place in small populations over relatively short geological time periods. However, the problem for this, well actually not the problem for this is what they think is a benefit, is that if you have all of the evolution taking place over short periods of time in very small populations, then that gives you very few opportunities for species to become fossilized. So they thought that by saying that evolution takes place in small populations over short time periods, this would reduce naturally the number of transitional organisms that would become fossilized, and this would potentially explain the lack of transitional forms. If you guys go back to this diagram that I showed earlier, where I said this is a model of evolution where all species still share a common ancestor and they still evolve by standard evolutionary mechanisms, but the evolution takes place very rapidly. So if you look at this diagram, you have the body plan on the x-axis and time on the y-axis. And you can see that the body plan will change, it will move along the x-axis, but it will barely move along the y-axis. So things are changing very quickly in very short periods of time. And this is how this model is supposed to work. Now, there are some problems with punctuated equilibrium. One of the biggest problems is that sort of the glory of Darwin's theory was that you had very, very large populations and very long periods of time where you could get these very special and sort of hallowed transitional forms to show up and be able to have the right mutations so they can evolve. But punctuated equilibrium sort of deprives Darwinism of both of these advantages. It says rather than evolution taking place in large populations over long periods of time, that evolution takes place over very short periods of time in very small populations. And this deprives Darwinism of the resources it needs for the right mutations to appear so that new species can evolve. And so there's really no genetic mechanism to account for such rapid change. Again, it requires too much change too quickly, but I also think that punctuated equilibrium is sort of suspicious. So let's say that I told you that I had a videotape, and on that videotape were leprechauns. And then I said, look, but you can't see them. But I promise they're there. They're just too small and too quick to be seen. Would you believe me? No, you would be a little bit suspicious, right? Well, this is exactly what punctuated equilibrium is doing with the fossil record. It's basically saying that the transitional forms did actually live, but they went by so quickly and they were so fast in size, in number, or so fast in time and so small in number that they didn't have time to be preserved as fossils. So I would call this sort of a form of special pleading, where we're being told we're supposed to accept evolution on a theory that predicts you will find no confirming evidence. And I don't think this makes for a very good scientific theory. Another response you will hear sometimes is that actually the transitional forms have been discovered. We do have transitional forms. And I would say, yes, occasionally we do find fossils which potentially could be considered transitional forms, but I would say this is kind of like people saying that even a broken clock is what is right twice a day, okay? So just because we have these transitional forms doesn't mean that they are the pattern that we see in the fossil record. The pattern is one where things appear abruptly. And in fact, some of the most prominent and famous examples of transitional forms really do not hold up when you look at them upon closer scrutiny. So for example, one transitional form is called Tiktaalik, which is supposed to be a transitional form between fish and four-legged land animals called tetrapods. And it is said that there was a prediction of evolution here that was fulfilled because Tiktaalik lived exactly in the right time period when fish were climbing out of the water and evolving into land animals. And this is supposed to be this amazing transitional form. And so actually this is a quote from Bill Nye where he's talking about how this prediction was fulfilled. He says, for many years, evolutionary scientists were frustrated that they could find no transitional forms between fish and land animals. They figured such a creature would live in a swamp or marsh, and he or she would have had to be living about 375 million years ago. And then he says, that is how Neil Shubin managed to find remarkable Tiktaalik. Scientists predicted that an animal like Tiktaalik would be found, and they found it. So the idea is that, according to evolution, you have to have this transitional form at this exact level of the fossil record. They went out, they found it, and this is a very nicely fulfilled prediction of evolution. Well, there was a problem. A few years after Tiktaalik was discovered, this prediction basically went belly up. And what happened was they found true footprints and tracks of four-legged land animals, of tetrapods, that were found in Poland that were dated to 18 million years before Tiktaalik. And what that means is that this fossil cannot be a transitional form leading to tetrapods because tetrapods already existed some 18 million years before this species even was around. So this was admitted actually by one of the senior editors for Nature, where he said that the neatly gift-wrapped correlation between stratigraphy and phylogeny, in which Alpine Gloucester is, hard word to say, represent a transitional form in the swift evolution of tetrapods, is a cruel illusion. If, as the Polish footprints show, tetrapods already existed, then an enormous evolutionary void has opened beneath our feet. So basically we have true tetrapod tracks at 397 million years ago, and then we have Tiktaalik at 375 million years ago. So we have basically evidence that Tiktaalik could not have been a transitional form because the tetrapods existed before it even was found. Now, this gets into how do we define a transitional form. And there's kind of two ways of defining transitional forms. One way is what I call the soft definition of a transitional organism that has features that might be intermediate between two types of organisms. But you can be a soft kind of transitional form even if you're not an actual transitional form, meaning that you couldn't be in the right place in the fossil record to be a transitional form. Now, a hard definition of transitional form is a much stronger claim. And this says that the fossil that we found actually was or could have been a real-life transitional fossil between two groups. And hard transitional forms are much harder to find. In fact, I know of very few examples of potential hard transitional forms from the fossil record. Another potential example of a transitional form is Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx is supposed to be evidence that birds evolved from dinosaurs. Now, Archaeopteryx was a true bird. It had feathers, it flew, and although it was a true bird, it also had teeth, claws, and a bony tail, kind of like dinosaurs. However, some modern birds have claws, like the Watson, but not have teeth or a bony tail, although there are quite a few true birds from the fossil record that also have teeth or a bony tail. Here's the problem, again, with Archaeopteryx. It appears about 145 million years ago, but the dinosaurs that are supposedly the ancestors of birds, they don't show up until much later, around 120 million years ago, 125 million years ago. So basically, the supposed evolutionary ancestors of birds don't show up in the fossil record until long after Archaeopteryx and other true birds are already found. So again, this poses a challenge to the claim that these dinosaurs are transitional forms leading to birds. They couldn't have been because birds were already around before the time they lived. So this is a quote talking about this. It says, the supposed theropod dinosaur ancestors of birds all occur in the fossil record after Archaeopteryx, and so cannot be directly ancestral. And so no fossils are known that could be common ancestors to both dinosaurs and birds. Let me give you guys one more example of a supposed transitional form from the fossil record. And this is supposed to document how whales evolved. According to the standard evolutionary view, you first had fish, and fish evolved out of the water. They climbed out of the water onto the land, and then fish evolved into amphibians, amphibians evolved into reptiles, reptiles evolved into mammals, and then certain kinds of mammals actually crawled back into the water and evolved back into fully aquatic organisms, and then some of those evolved into water-living whales. So according to the standard evolutionary view, whales are actually descended from land mammals that fully live on the land. And it is claimed sometimes that there are fossils that document transitional forms between these supposed land mammal ancestors of whales and fully aquatic whales. But there are some serious problems with this argument. Number one, if you look at the fossil record, there's actually not a lot of time to evolve from a fully terrestrial land mammal to a fully aquatic whale. In fact, according to the fossil record, there are less than 10 million years allowed to go from a fully land mammal to a fully aquatic whale, perhaps even less time. Another problem is that if you look at whales, whales have many special features which allow them to have this fully aquatic lifestyle. I won't go through all of these, but they include changes to their vertebrae shape. The fact that they have a flute at the end of they don't have legs basically, they have a flute. They have reduced hind limbs. They have flippers instead of front arms. They can drink seawater. They have special adaptations so they can give birth and nurse their young underwater. They have special modifications of the way they breathe, so they can have a blowhole. And male whales have special circulatory systems that allow them to keep their testes cool so they can produce sperm. So there's all kinds of special changes that whales have that allow them to live in a fully aquatic lifestyle. So the question you can ask is there enough time in, say, this less than 10 million years to evolve whales from this land mammal? Well, the problem is that we are dealing with basically variables that do not help the evolutionary process very much. The various variables that you want to look at, you want to ask, how long would it take a trait to evolve? Would be things like the population size. The bigger the population, the more opportunities you have for a new trait to evolve. The generation time. The longer or the shorter the generation time, the more organisms will live and the more opportunities you have for something to evolve. The mutation rate. If mutation rates are very high, that will again give you more opportunities for things to evolve. And also the time available from the fossil record. If you don't have a lot of time, that's bad for evolution. You want long periods of time so that things have long time for them to evolve. The problem with whales is that each of these variables, each of these properties and parameters are working against the evolutionary process. With the population size of whales, it's going to be very small, which is bad for evolution. Generation times tend to be very long, which is bad for evolution. the mutation rates in most mammals compared to most other species will be very low. So that's bad for evolution. And then the time available for the fossil record is very short. Again, we're talking about less than 10 million years. Now, you might think 10 million years is a long time, but when you have a generation time of, say, 10 or 20 years, that's only a few 100,000 generations, and we're probably talking about many millions of mutations that need to happen. So what this means is that evolution does not have very many rolls of the dice to get the right mutations to evolve new traits in a population of whale ancestors. And in fact, there was a study in the journal Genetics that found that if you have a trait that requires just 2 mutations before it gives you some advantage, then in an organism that has sort of a small population size, that could take up to 200 million years for such a trait to evolve. So clearly we do not have enough time to evolve these traits. So what this means is that even in this best case, where whale evolution was called the poster child for macroevolution, and supposedly shows these amazing transitional fossils, it is a mathematical impossibility that evolution occurred via unguided evolutionary, like neo-Darwinian evolutionary mechanisms. There's basically too many rewirings and too little time, as one scientist puts it. So in this situation, we can basically give a mathematical disproof of the claim that whales evolved by standard evolutionary mechanisms. You just have to change too many things, and you don't have enough time to do it. Okay, so getting back to these 3 models of the fossil record. Gradualism, this idea that there are slow, gradual changes, really doesn't work. It's not supported by the fossil record. Punctuated equilibrium, it might match the fossil record and it predicts you won't have transitional forms, but it faces some serious problems because it requires too much genetic change too quickly. And for that reason, many biologists have not really latched on to punctuated equilibrium as a very good model, and it really has not gotten very popular. So it's not a very good model. I would say that the best way to look at the fossil record is to just take the data at face value. If the data is showing a pattern of explosions and abrupt appearance of new types of organisms, why can't we just accept that? Why do we have to infer all this evolutionary history that's not there? So I think the ID-based view of sort of these explosions in the history of life is a much better way to look at the fossil record. We don't have to look for things that aren't there. We can say we can take the fossil record at face value and claim that basically we can just accept the data as we see it. So now I want to talk to you guys about another interesting pattern in the history of life, and that is what we call stasis. So what is stasis? Well, stasis is a very interesting observation we see in the fossil record that after these explosions of new types of organisms, body plans tend to remain largely unchanged for long periods of time. And this is called stasis. So you see new types of organisms appearing abruptly, but then their body plans really don't change. And evolution, of course, means change, but stasis means no change. So stasis is sort of like the opposite of evolution. Stephen Jay Gould was a big proponent of stasis, and I need to understand it. He said stasis is data. And he notes that the overwhelming prevalence of stasis became an embarrassing feature of the fossil record's best loved ignored as a manifestation of nothing that is non-evolution. So let's look at some really remarkable examples of stasis, where we see organisms that have been around for hundreds of millions of years in some cases, and they barely change. One example are monophylephorans, which are basically a shell type of mollusks that are known from Paleozoic rocks dating to 345 million years ago. And you can find fossils of this that look almost identical to the monophylephorans that we see in the present day. Snails or gastropods. We can find snails in the fossil record that have a basic body plan almost identical to modern snails. This is a preapulid worm fossil that actually is from the Cambrian explosion. I took these fossils when I was at the Burgess Shale in Canada. But if you look at a living preapulid worm, they're very, very similar. In fact, you can see this thing potentially leaving an imprint that looks like this in the fossil record. And this is, from 500 million years ago. Horseshoe crabs are very famous. They trace back over 400 million years, and yet fossils of horseshoe crabs look virtually identical to modern horseshoe crabs. Tadpole shrimp, another nice example of an arthropod that really hasn't changed at all. They go back 360 million years, and they're almost identical to the modern version. This Cambrian bivalve plant, or another kind of mollusk, they trace back, again, 500 million years, and they look almost identical to many types of modern bivalve plant species. The Lingula, which is a lamp-shell brachiopod, those trace back 400 to 500 million years, and again, they look almost identical to, in their modern form, to their fossil counterparts. Lungfish are very similar in the past to lungfish that are alive today, and they go back to 400 million years. The coelacanth, which is a famous species of fish that was thought to have gone extinct. Well, it was actually discovered off the coast of Madagascar in the 1930s, and then also in Indonesia. But these fish trace back to 400 million years ago. Sharks also go back to over 400 million years ago, and we have fossil sharks that have a body plan that is basically the same as a modern shark. Tuataras are a type of lizard-like reptile, and they have barely changed their appearance over the last 200 million years. Crocodiles. We were at the nature reserve here in Nairobi a couple days ago, and we saw a huge crocodile. Well, crocodiles have also barely changed their body plan. This article says that crocodiles today look the same as they did 200 million years ago. Now, the modern possum only arose about 23 million years ago, but there are things that look very much like a modern possum that go back over 100 million years. We also find stasis in plants. Ferns, according to one article, one type of fern is virtually unchanged for 180 million years. The ginkgo plant is also a living fossil, and they go back over 100 million years. Cycads, another type of plant, go back to the Jurassic period. And they look very, very similar to their modern form. The Lundy pine tree from New Zealand, from Australia, goes back at least 50 million years. The nightcap oak, which is also from Australia, those go back over 90 million years. They look very, very similar. And finally, perhaps the most remarkable example of stasis would be stromatolites. Stromatolites are these bacterial mats. I actually got to see a number of these in the field when I was doing my PhD research. They're basically fossilized mats of bacteria that grow in shallow water, and they will sort of form these clumpy structures where bacterial mats will grow one on top of the other. And we find these throughout the fossil record. They go back to at least about 3.4 billion years ago, but they're still living today in Shark Bay, Australia, and other locations. So there's this remarkable pattern of stasis in the fossil record. So okay, let's close this up now by asking if we can construct a theory of biological design via paleontology using the scientific method. And again, remember the scientific method uses observation, hypothesis, experiment, or our study of nature, and then we make a conclusion. So we're going to start with an observation here, and that is that when intelligent agents act, they provide a sufficient causal explanation for the origin of large amounts of information, since we have considerable experience of intelligent agents generating informational configurations of matter. What are we saying here? When intelligent agents act, they generate large amounts of information. And if you think about the way that, say, some kind of technology designer will introduce their designs, their technologies into the world, they will introduce them fully formed, ready to be used by the consumer, all ready to go. And yet that is exactly what we see in the fossil record. We see that fossils appear in a fully formed manner. So we're going to make a prediction that new types of organisms representing the appearance of new genetic information, because all these new types of organisms require new genetic information, that these will appear abruptly in the fossil record without similar precursors. So what do we find when we look at the data? Well, here's a quote from a zoology textbook. It says, to sort of recap all of this, many species remain virtually unchanged for millions of years, then suddenly disappeared to be replaced by a quite different but related form. So we're talking about stasis and abrupt appearance. It says, moreover, most major groups of animals appear abruptly in the fossil record, fully formed, and with no fossils yet discovered that form a transition from their parent group. This is a quote from Eugene Koonin, a very prominent biologist in the United States. And he says that major transitions in biological evolution show the same pattern of sudden emergence of diverse forms at a new level of complexity. The relationship between major groups within an emergent new class of biological entities are hard to decipher. He says they do not seem to fit the tree pattern that, following Darwin's original proposal, remains the dominant description of biological evolution. So he's saying that we see things appearing in a sudden manner that doesn't fit the tree-like pattern, this tree of life that Darwin predicts. Now it's very interesting. This article that I just quoted was published in a journal called Biology Direct. And this journal has what is called open access peer review, where you can see the comments from the other scientists who reviewed this paper before it was published. And one reviewer was very unhappy with this paper. It says, in each major class of biological objects, the principal types emerge ready-made and intermediate grades cannot be identified. And they said, ouch, that will be up on IB websites faster than one can blink an eye. And I thought this was really funny because they're not interested in just allowing Eugene Koonin to speak the truth of what we see in the fossil record. They're worried about lending credence to intelligent design. And so Eugene Koonin actually had a very nice response to this. And he said, I really do not understand the concern. I changed ready-made to abruptly to avoid any ID illusions and added clarifications. But beyond that, there's little I can do because this is an important sentence that accurately and clearly portrays a crucial and to the very best of my understanding, real feature of evolutionary transitions. So what he's saying is, look, this is what the data said. You might not like it, but don't prevent me from talking about what the fossil evidence shows. And he says, will this be used by the ID camp? He says, perhaps, if they read that part of the paper, we actually do read papers, by the way. Lots of us read, we all read lots of papers all the time. But he says, however, I am afraid that if our goal as evolutionary biologists is to avoid providing any grist for the ID mill, we should simply claim as Darwin, in principle, solve all the problems of the origin of biological complexity in his eye story, and only minor details remain to be filled in. He said, actually, I think the position of some ultra-Darwinists is pretty close to that. But he thinks that this is totally counterproductive, and such a notion is outright false. And then he says, and the ID folks are clever in their own perverse way. They see through such false simplicity and seize on it. I think we students of evolution should openly admit that the emergence of new levels of complexity is a complex problem and should try to work out solutions, some of which can be distinctly non-orthodox. So this is a really fascinating quote, you guys, because it really shows that the evolutionary biology community is struggling to grapple with the lack of transitional forms in the fossil record. Some people want to talk about it openly, other people want to hide it, and they don't know how to answer the question scientifically. And I really respect Eugene Koonin because he's being really honest and open about problems with evolutionary theory. And I think this is really the only way that science is going to solve these problems. So I respect what he said here very much. So our conclusion is that the abrupt appearance of new types of organisms and the genetic information required to build their body plans is best explained by intelligent design. Because where in our experience does new genetic information come from? The kind of information that is needed to rapidly build all these types of organisms. It would only come from intelligence. So just to wrap it up, we observed that intelligent agents can rapidly infuse large amounts of information into these systems. We predict that new types of organisms will appear abruptly in the fossil record, reflecting this abrupt appearance of new information. And then when we look at the data, the fossil record shows a pattern of explosions where new types of organisms appear suddenly, like the Cambrian explosion, the Nampo explosion, etc. And we conclude that major groups of organisms appeared where they rose by intelligent design. And intelligent design is the best explanation for the patterns that we see in the fossil record. So thank you guys very much. Finish a little early, I'll take some questions.